The question of whether or not human beings have free will has been an ongoing mystery for thinkers of all kinds for millenniums. I want to read something from Paramahansa Yogananda about the issue of free will. He says, in the history of religion, there is a perennial debate as to which is more important, divine grace or human effort. The answer, he says, is quite simple, and the masters have tried to convey it to people in their teachings. Mankind must do his best, of course. His best, however, will be crowned with success to the extent that he realizes that it isn't he as a human being who is acting or who is the doer, but God who is acting through him, inspiring and guiding him. To think of God as the doer doesn't make a person passive. It takes great effort of will to be receptive to him. The devotee must offer himself positively and joyfully into the flow of inner grace. The power that is in you is your own, but God-given. Use it. God won't use it for you. The more you attune your will during activity to his infinite will, the more you will find that her power, or his power, and blessing strengthening and guiding you in everything you do. In our Western culture, we put a stronger emphasis on the individual self than in the East, where many of the great contemplative traditions have originated. When we ask whether or not we have free will, usually in our culture, we're assuming that we are asking whether or not our separate self is free to choose on its own. Does our self, as we think and experience ourselves to be, have the freedom of choice? Or are the thoughts and other experiences we have predetermined by forces outside of our awareness? With this type of asking, we are assuming that there indeed is a real entity that is our separate self. We assume that it is uniquely ours, and that there are indeed outside forces that can affect our experience of this separate self and its choices. Buddhist philosophy, as well as Eastern philosophy in general, don't make this assumption that there is an actual entity of self that exists by itself, or that has or possesses its own being, or that it can exist by itself and that we can label it as ours. In addressing the question of whether or not a person has free will, can we separate that question from the question of what is a person? What are the boundaries and actual substance of a person? If the experience of willing is free, can we find an actual entity that is doing the willing? There's an old story, an old Zen story about Bodhidharma, the great Zen master who brought Zen Buddhism from India to China. His spirit of inquiry is legendary in the history of Zen, and he is said to have sat in front of a wall for 9 years, arduously and deeply immersing his whole being in the heart of the Buddhist teaching about the true nature of self and liberation from human suffering. One of his closest disciples, named Jinko, intimately shared Bodhidharma's deep yearning for truth. Life was very difficult in those days, even for monks who renounced the world. One day, in a state of extreme desperation, Jinko came before his master and said, "Master, my mind is deeply agitated. Please pacify it for me." He was so desperate that he had cut off his arm, or maybe he was ready to cut off his arm, to show to Bodhidharma. Bodhidharma replied, "Show me this mind of yours, and I'll pacify it for you." So Jinko spent the next few days out in the cold, in the falling snow, searching for his mind. He searched for his mind with his whole heart. He really stretched his limits of willpower, deeply contemplating the question of how much can I or anybody want to find the actual essence of what we are, what life actually is. He even spent all of several nights standing outside Bodhidharma's room. Finally, when he was completely exhausted, he returned to Bodhidharma and confessed, "Master, I have searched with all my heart and soul, but I cannot find my mind." Well, he means, I cannot find myself that stands alone, myself that possesses any own being. Bodhidharma replied, "Then I have already put it to rest for you." So we can say, in a way, this not finding is the finding of an aliveness free from the confines of all our ideas, because Jinko exhausted all his ideas. He took the energy of his thinking and just expanded it as far as he could go. Finally, he just had to give up. And an awareness dawned in him that all these thoughts, all these fears, all this experience, he really didn't know what it was. And there was an aliveness welling up in him. It was experiencing the love of the freedom from the confines of that idea of a separate self. So we could also frame this story in terms of the great doubt. You know, I've talked a lot about the great doubt. Hakuin said, if you doubt deeply, you will awaken deeply. So we could say that Jinko deeply immersed himself into the great doubt of suffering. What is suffering? What is freedom? What am I? What is my mind? And so this not finding that transforms, kind of flips into the affirmation of the freedom from the confines of our thinking, of ourself, of our separate self. Becomes an affirmation of what actually is present here, now, always. And so, Buddha, when was asked about the question of free will versus determinism, he replied that they're both just ideas. And the aliveness of our true self, the aliveness of our very self, dissolves all those ideas. So there's sort of an intuition that we can't find what determines us, as well as we can't find the individual separate self that we think we are. So simultaneous with this realization is that finding of that love of freedom. We discover that what's actually here it's not just that what's actually here is completely free, because when we bring up the idea of freedom, we're also, by definition, admitting the possibility of bondage. Right? So we could say that Jinko realized that being the doer, being the finder of his mind, is itself bondage. But it's not so much that when he found this aliveness that's free from the confines of our thinking, free from the confines of our ideas, all ideas, that deep doubting of all ideas. He found this love of freedom. And it's not just that he finds himself free. He finds that his very self, very deep self, is freedom itself, is totally free. One of the sad parts of doing this, the contemplative path, or embarking on the contemplative path, is realizing how deep our conditioning is to believe that we're not free, that we're bound by this idea of being a separate being. So we learn to offer all of our experience, offer all of our conditioning, all of our fears, all of our doubts, to the actual being that is here, the actual presence that we all share. And in a way, we'll discover that we're actually doubting all our ideas about it in the process, and that we're affirming the actual aliveness that we are. Yogananda called it, he called it an electric current. He had a saying, God is the electricity, human beings are the light bulbs. So that actual current that animates us all the time, it's with us all the time. Just keep coming back to the awareness of this aliveness. And we'll keep trying to tell stories about it, try to describe it. That's part of being human. So we offer our experience, our doubts, all our insecurities, our fears, the different types of pain we experience. Offer it to this presence. We can't find the controller. We can't find what controls our experience, gives rise to our experience. But we can surrender to this current of life force. It's being given by a higher power, as Yogananda says. The devotee must offer himself positively and joyfully into the flow of inner grace. The power that is in you is your own, but God-given. Use it, God won't use it for you. The more you attune your will during activity to His infinite will, the more you will find His power and blessing strengthening and guiding you in everything you do.